Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second lesson on the topic of race and inequality for this week. And so in this lesson, we're going to be talking a little bit more about some kind of contemporary issues and contemporary experiences dealing with race in America. So, in the last lesson, we looked at kind of some fundamental aspects of race, experience of race in America, dealing with issues of economic inequality and also health inequalities and the persistence of segregation. And so in this lesson, we're going to talk, deal with some kind of more contemporary issues of race, although, we're going to see that, even though they're contemporary, they're also actually nothing new. And so, I think most people would agree that in the last 3 to 4 years or longer, it has been a period in which America is still, it's obvious that America is still trying to come to terms with its race relations. Particularly in the last year, we have seen, various protests around the country over the experience of Black Americans being killed by police. And so this has, sparked, protests and, kind of issues of racial unrest. And so I think all of it is pretty clearly to show that America is still dealing with race, and it still tends to be a relevant topic. I think that, in the 21st century, and some people thought with the presidency of Barack Obama that we might be entering a post-racial society, a society in which race would be becoming less important. But I think that it has not come to be true, right? That race and racial identity is still something that is very much relevant for today. So in today's lesson, I'm going to be talking about two different things. So the first is this basically kind of giving some facts and some information about the experience of race and the criminal justice system, right? So again, we can remember that inequality is not just economic inequality. It's not just about, differences in wealth and income. It's also differences in experiences of life. And one of the major different experiences of life is how different racial groups interact with the criminal justice system, and in particular, how Black Americans have a greater negative experience with the criminal justice system. So after giving these facts and kind of giving some ideas around them, then we're going to talk about the concept of institutional racism. And so this will give us a way to understand some of the things I'm going to be saying earlier on in the lesson and some of the things that I talked about in Tuesday's lesson. So institutional racism is sometimes called systematic racism or systemic racism. And in general, it's this idea that there is discrimination that's resulting from the structure of society. Anyway, so we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so first let's talk about the experience of race. In the criminal justice system. And so here we're really going to be seeing that particularly Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, people of color, have more of a negative interaction with the criminal justice system. So one of the first ways we can think about this is talk about incarceration rates, right? The likelihood of going to prison in America. And so what we see here, what we see in this graph is a little bit old. The numbers might be a little bit different now. But on the left, what we see is, the various population sizes of 3 different racial groups in America, right? Non-Hispanic whites, Black Americans, and then Hispanic or Latino Americans. And so what we see is that, white Americans still represent the majority, racial group, and then we have Black Americans and Hispanic Americans at about 15 or 16% each. And so what we see then is that Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are vastly overrepresented in terms of the prison population. And so even though they represent only a certain proportion, a minority proportion of the entire population, they're nearing the majority population of prisons. And so we see that Black Americans in particular are kind of overrepresented in the prison population. And we see this more starkly when we talk about the lifetime risk of going to prison, right? And so what we see is that so here we're looking at white men in particular, since males have a much higher chance of going to prison than females, right? There's a gender difference there. But what we see is for the white men, like myself, there's a relatively small chance of going to prison, right? 1 in 17. Right. But for Black men, it becomes quite common, right? That there's a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison, and then a 1 in 6 chance for Hispanic American men. And so what we see is that your racial identity is not just affecting, how much income or wealth you have, but really affecting your chance of going to prison. Right. A lot of this is due to what's so-called the war on drugs. Right, that that people were given, Americans were since the 1970s onwards started to be really incarcerated for drug offenses, including marijuana, but other drugs. So we see here first we have a discrepancy in incarceration, right? The probability or the percentages of imprisonment in America by race. So what we see is it's also a disparities in terms of arrest rates and sentencing. So here is a good example of a discrepancy or disparity in terms of arrest rates. And I like to point this out for a couple of reasons. One, it's kind of a common, very common charge, and it really highlights the disparities quite well. Right. So here, what we see in this graph, what we see is the marijuana usage rate compared with whites and Black Americans. Right. And so what we can see in this graph is that the usage rates are pretty similar. Right. Black Americans maybe use marijuana a little bit more than white Americans, maybe like 1 or 2% more, maybe. But their usage rates are pretty similar to one another, right? There's not a vast difference here, right? But when we look at arrest rates, right, what we see is that even though Black Americans and white Americans are relatively similar in their usage of marijuana, Black Americans are much more likely to get arrested for this. Right. And so, even though marijuana has become over time, a relatively, it's become more and more normal, right, more and more acceptable. What we see is that even in the 21st century, Black Americans were much more likely to get arrested for this and get a charge and be imprisoned for this. Right. And so what we see is, that Black Americans are about 3 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana, even though their usage rates are the same. And another reason why I point this out is that when we're thinking about incarceration rates, there might be this idea that Black Americans are imprisoned more because they are doing more criminal activities, right? That it's simply a result of more criminal activities. But this graph here on marijuana shows that that's actually not true. Right? Even when Black Americans and white Americans are doing a similar level of deviance, right? So smoking marijuana is by the law deviant, right? Against the norms, against the rules of society. Even when Black Americans and white Americans are doing a similar level of deviance, Black Americans are experiencing more social control, right? So it's not that they're being more deviant. It's just that, in terms of marijuana, it's that the social control is being more inflicted upon them. Along with this, we see not just disparities in arrest rates, but we also see disparities in sentencing, right? And so what we see here is that Black American men receive about 20% longer sentences than white American men for similar charges, right? This was a kind of a study done by the Wall Street Journal, right? So, a pretty conservative, right-leaning journal, not one to, be, biased, but, very legitimate newspaper in America. And then what we see is that, this, right of center newspaper found that Black Americans were really receiving much longer sentences, right, for similar offenses, right? And so again, it shows this idea of disparity, right? It's not that Black American men are being more criminal, but rather that even when they're being criminal to the same extent as white American men, they are getting punished more severely for it, right? About 20% more severely, right? And so we see this, we really see, this experience of, disparity in the experience of the criminal justice system, that Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are more likely to have an experience with the criminal justice system, and then to be treated more severely if that does happen. One thing that kind of connects with the reading that I assigned for today is a more kind of, I think, a recent experience of white Americans calling police on Black Americans, right? I say it's recent, but it's actually, we don't know because it's only been recognized as being recent. With the advent of the internet and the advent of smartphones that we can record, what we have found is that there have been these numerous instances of evidence of white Americans calling police on Black Americans. And so there's some kind of well-known cases of this. I think the most well-known case that really sparked this phenomenon, or sparked the awareness of this phenomenon, was when two Black men in Philadelphia were arrested for being in Starbucks, right? They were meeting a business partner in Starbucks. They asked to use the bathroom before the other person showed up. And then the person working at Starbucks called the police on them, and the police came and arrested them for literally just being in Starbucks, right? And, official charge of trespassing. And then, later it was found, this became a big kind of news story. But then after that, there has been many instances of the same situation. White Americans calling police on Black Americans when they wanted to enter a pool, white Americans calling police on Black Americans when they were using a private gym, white Americans calling police on college student in Yale because she suspected that the person was not really a student there when they were in fact were. And we have these hosts of instances in which white Americans seem to be calling in the criminal justice system to support, to have a formal sanction put on Black Americans. And so the question is, how can we understand this phenomenon? What's happening here that is encouraging white Americans to do this? And this really connects with your reading. And so Elijah Anderson, the author of Reading, is talked about white spaces. And so let me kind of describe his concept a little bit, even though you have it in your reading, right? But basically the idea here is that, historically in America, we have been segregated to a certain extent, right? We have had different spaces for different racial groups, right? And that, this is changing in America. Anderson talks about so-called cosmopolitan spaces, spaces in which the races, different racial groups mix, people of different racial identities are in the same space. But then there's still this idea of certain white spaces, right? So, certain, idea of white neighborhoods or, social gathering spaces that have been historically occupied by white Americans, right? And so what has happened, Anderson argues, is that some Black Americans have seen their economic fortunes rise, right? We know in the previous lesson there is, inequality in terms of economics, but, there is now also a Black middle class, right? So Black Americans have seen, some Black Americans have seen their fortunes rise. And so now, because of that, because of their improved economic situation, they're now beginning to enter spaces that have traditionally been white, right? So pools, Ivy League universities, other places that have historically been occupied only or solely by white Americans. Now, what happens, Anderson argues, is that when Black Americans enter these spaces, they can be more heavily scrutinized, right? It can be, because the white Americans, the majority group, this is a new experience for them. They can ask, well, what's happening here? Why am I seeing a change, in this experience? And so then to kind of the Black Americans are scrutinized and then push back and say, there's no reason to scrutinize me. And then the white Americans will then call in police or criminal justice system to back up their sense of authority, right? And so what we really see, in some sense, I would argue, is that white Americans some white Americans can tend to use the criminal justice system to support their own privilege, right? To support their own authority in certain spaces, right? And so connected with this is, so this is the idea of a white space. And the idea is, Anderson also talks about the ideas of what's called an iconic ghetto, right? That white Americans can sometimes have in their minds this idea of spaces where just Black Americans reside, right? And so they have this idea that Black Americans, will be in this different space from them, the so-called ghetto, an inner city or, other places, but not in the social gathering places that they have traditionally recognized as their own, a park, a suburb, an elite university. And so because there is this kind of stereotypical preconception of, where Black Americans reside, when Black Americans kind of step out of those spaces and into a white space, again, some white Americans experience that as disconcerting or unsettling, or they don't understand, what's happening. And so again, I think it really harks back to, in some way, is this idea of segregation, right? We think of segregation as something of the past, but it really isn't. And we can see that segregation isn't just something, segregation isn't just kind of like, going to separate schools or, officially separate, eating restaurants, but it can just be white Americans assuming or presuming that certain spaces are theirs, right? Kind of a de facto form of segregation, right? And again, what I would argue is I don't think that this is all white Americans, right? It's important not to, describe a group in any one way, but, it's maybe more of a segment of certain white Americans who are, thinking in this way. And again, this might be a generational thing. It might be changing, with younger generations that are more multicultural. Okay. What about race and traffic stops, right? So here, we're talking not just about, kind of more severe consequences of, going to prison or something like that, but, kind of just a routine traffic stop. Is it true that there is such a thing as, driving while Black, right? That you're more likely to get pulled over by a police officer if you're a person of color? Does the data support that claim? In general, yes, it does. Right. So this is research, particularly taken from New York. Right. So Black drivers in New York were 30% more likely to be pulled over at a traffic stop than white drivers. And then in controlling for their population size. Right. And what's also interesting is that when people of color were pulled over, right, they were more likely to have their car searched, right? So it's not just that they were more likely to be pulled over, but when they were pulled over, it was more likely that a car search was to be conducted, right? So it's relatively rare for white drivers to have their car searched, only 2% of the cases. It's still rare for Black drivers and Hispanic drivers, but about 3 times more likely, right? So about 6%, right? And so what we see here is, it's not just severe consequences like going to prison that are there disparities, but just also in routine interactions with police that we see disparities happening. I think in the last 5 years or so, the biggest difference, or not a difference, the most severe thing that we have become aware of is police shootings of Black Americans, right? And that this is really what has been the basis of a lot of the protests in the last year and the basis of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? They're really coming out of these shootings and saying, look, our lives matter. Black Americans' lives should not be treated as worthless. Black American lives are important, right? And that a simple statement that they matter. And so, over the last number of years, we've seen many instances of Black Americans getting shot and killed by police, right? So this year, the one famous instance of this is George Floyd, who was killed in Minneapolis. He was not shot, but he was killed when a police officer put his leg or his knee on his neck and strangled him till he died. There's a case of Breonna Taylor, who also in 2020 was shot and killed by police when they entered her apartment in a no-knock warrant. Alton Sterling, who was killed in 2016 in Baton Rouge when he was unarmed and fatally shot by 2 police officers. Freddie Gray, who was killed in Baltimore in 2015 when he's being transported in a police van. Tamir Rice, who was a 12-year-old boy, right? So not even an adult, but a young 12-year-old boy who was shot and killed by police in Cleveland, Ohio, who presumed he had a gun, but turned out to be a toy gun. But Tamir Rice was shot within about 30 seconds of the police, coming onto the scene, right? So not really waiting to verify the facts. Alton Sterling, again, who was killed in 2016 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, when 2 officers fatally shot him in his car and he was unarmed. Sam Dubose, killed in 2015 in Cincinnati, Ohio, by police in his car, and he was also unarmed. Eric Garner, killed in New York City in 2014 when police officers put him in an illegal chokehold and he strangled to death. Right, Walter Scott, killed by police in South Carolina, also unarmed, and he was shot in the back when he was running away. And so, this is occurrences of all these people and many, many, many others, right? And so what we see actually is that, go back in the slides for a second. One moment. So what we see actually is that, from these instances, we find that, Black Americans in particular have a fearful experience of police interactions, right? So while white Americans are more likely to say that they're more secure than less secure when police are around, Black Americans are much more likely to say that they feel less secure, right? Particularly Black American men feel, have a sense of fear around interactions with police, and that there is a real palatable fear of experiencing violence and being shot and killed. All right, and so we really see this different interaction with police. White Americans and some other racial groups really are kind of split even on feeling less or more secure, whereas Black Americans really feel, less secure with police interactions. And so in general, we have these instances of these numerous people being, shot by police. But what about the overall data? Is it besides from these kind of well-known instances, is it true that Black Americans are more likely to be shot and killed by police than other racial groups? And the short answer is yes. So up the top, what we see is from 2012, the population size of these different racial groups, Black, Hispanic, and white. And then we see their percentages of being killed by police. And so what we see is that Black Americans are overrepresented in terms of their population of being killed and shot by police, right? So whereas Black Americans in 2012 were about 13% of the population, they represented about 31% of the people being shot by police, right? And whereas the other racial groups, were less so. When we look at kind of unarmed shootings, so when Black Americans are, whether somebody is being killed when they're really not being threatening towards the police, right? So the idea that the police really have no justification for shooting the person. What we see is that, again, Black Americans, again, are even more so represented, right? 13% of the population, but about 39% of the people who are killed by police while not attacking. And so it is really true that being Black in America increases your likelihood of being killed by the police, even when you're unarmed and even when you're not attacking, right? And so we see this here, and just put it in a different way. This is another graph showing showing the rates of police shootings per million people, right? So, police shootings are relatively rare. And so what we see is that, again, just showing the same data in a different way, that, Black Americans are overrepresented in police shootings. And actually the only racial group that's more overrepresented in terms of their population is Native Americans, right? And so we see Black Americans and Native Americans being overrepresented and being more likely to be killed by police than other racial groups. Right? And so we see this again in terms of the lifetime risk, right? Somebody's lifetime risk of being shot by the police. And so what we see is that, per 100,000, that the lifetime risk for Black Americans is about twice as high as it is for white Americans, right? So it really, the data really does bear it out to be true that in particular Black Americans are experiencing more violence and more fatal shootings by the police in America. And what's also important to be aware of is that, the police are rarely, if ever, charged in these situations, right? So a study done of police shootings from 2014 to 2019, 99% of the time, the police officer was not charged, right, with any crime. And we have seen this, in these well-known instances, that police officers are now more likely to be charged, but not actually, there really has been very few or very rare cases in which the police officer has been sentenced or actually punished for anything. Okay. So what we have is really, a situation in America in which different racial groups are being treated unequally. Right? There's no really other way to say that. And we see this in multiple different ways. We see this in terms of economics. We see this in terms of health outcomes. We see this in terms of life expectancy. We see this in terms of the experience of the criminal justice system. And so now in the second part of today's lesson, I want to kind of talk about, well, what's happening here? How can we understand this experience of, racial inequality? How can we explain, what's going on, particularly with the experience of Black Americans? So the way to understand this is through the concept of what's called institutional racism. And so to understand institutional racism or systemic racism, let's kind of go back to just the most general idea of racism and talk about, what that means. Right? So racism, as we generally understand it, means when racial groups are being treated in a different way or unfair ways because of their racial identity. Typically, what we do is we break up racism into two parts. We can talk about prejudice, right? Which is prejudice is simply stereotypical beliefs, right? Racism that's going on inside people's heads, right? So thinking in a racist way or having racist thoughts, right? So this can be stereotypes, believing that a certain group is lazy or less intelligent or, some whatever, right? Or it can even be positive, thinking that some racial group is better at math. That's also a stereotype. That's also a form of prejudice, right? And so whenever we have a mental assumption about a racial group, particularly one that's negative, we're being prejudicial, right? We're really, we're not treating people equally. Then we have discrimination. So discrimination isn't just, thinking that people are different, but now it's one step further. It's treating people in a different way, right? It's kind of racist behavior or racist actions, right? So now it's here something like telling a racist joke, using racist insults or racist words. It is not hiring somebody because of their race, right? It's not just what you think, it's now you're doing something, right? Now you're acting discriminatory towards a person. Okay, so what I would say is, traditionally speaking, we think of racism on the individualistic level, right? That when we think of racism, both in the form of prejudice and discrimination, we think of it as a person is racist. Like, oh, that individual is acting in a racist way, right? That person over there is being discriminatory, right? That we think of racism as something a single person does, right? And what we think is, oh, persons should not be racist, right? Individuals should not be racist. The last concept I want to bring up is a way to think about racism that goes against that idea. And that is the concept of institutional racism. So what is institutional racism? Institutional racism is the unequal treatment of racial groups, but not based on the actions, just on the actions of individuals, but based in this very structure of society. Right? And so what this is saying is that the reason why racial groups have different and unequal experiences of the world is because of the way that our society is structured or organized. And so that discrimination or racism is happening at a very fundamental level, right? It's not happening at the level of individuals, but it's happening at the level of the structure of society. And so what this means is that we cannot just change individuals. We can't just educate people or tell them to be better. But to get rid of racism, what we actually have to do is change or alter the structure of society, right? That racism is in some sense embedded into the way our various society functions. Right? And so that's the first point. The second point is, this institutional form of racism, a racism that is operating at the structure of society, can exist with or without racist individuals. You can have institutional racism where the people themselves are racist, but you can also have a form of racism, institutional racism, where the people aren't trying to be racist, not that we know of. Okay, so what would be some examples of this? Right? So a classic example of this is slavery, right? So here we have, experience of slavery in America, right? A situation in which one majority group with power, white Americans, treated another racial group as not human, right? Treated Black Americans as property rather than citizens, right? And use violence and murders and killings to enforce their superior position, right? And so we have to, it's important to remember that, this form of society existed for many, for a long, long time in America, right? That the system of institutional racism of slavery was around for, a very long time in America. Right? And so this is a situation in which there is racism happening at the institutional level. Right? It is embedded into the very structure of society. It is part of the legal system of America. It is part of the economic system of America, right? It is not just that you have a bunch of racist individuals, which you do, but rather you also have a very structure of society that is racist and treating some people as less than human than other people. Right? So here, this is an example of institutional racism, right? Slavery, right? Not just a result of a few racist individuals, but the result of a racist society. We can now look at a contemporary experience of institutional racism, and one, pretty different than slavery. So because I'm contrasting here and bringing in a kind of contemporary or modern example of how we can also think about institutional racism. It's not just slavery, but there are contemporary forms of institutional racism. So we can think about school quality, right? And so what we see here is data again from 2012, so kind of some recent data about the quality of high schools in America. Right, so what we see here in this graph is that particularly Hispanic Americans and Black Americans are going to poorer quality schools than white Americans and Asian Americans, right? That Hispanic Americans and Black Americans are not getting as good of a high school education as their white and Asian counterparts, right? And we see this in terms of the quality of schools, and not just in this graph, but there's many other graphs to kind of back this up. And so we want to understand this. So, why is this happening, right? Again, what I would argue is it's not just racist individuals here. It's not, it's not just that there's some racist person, some school person out there, and this person is making Black Americans and Hispanic Americans going to bad schools and allowing white Americans to go to good schools. No, it's more complicated than that. What I'm going to argue is that the differences in school quality is really about the structure of society. That there's something about how we have organized our society that is producing this unequal outcome in terms of school quality. So let's delve in a little bit more deeply. Okay, so what do we know? First thing we know is that still in the 21st century, Americans tend to go to segregated high schools, right? So white students tend to go to schools that are majority white. Black students tend to go to schools that are majority Black. Hispanic students tend to go to schools that are majority Hispanic, right? There is intermixing, there's people of different races in every school, but people tend to go to schools in which the majority of the people are of their own race, right? So there's a certain degree of segregation in the schools. Okay, why are the schools segregated? Because the neighborhoods are segregated, right? So in America, public schools, people tend to go to schools in their own school district, right? That tend to be in their neighborhood, right? So if you are living in a majority Black neighborhood, like say, for example, somewhere in Brooklyn that's majority Black, your school then is going to be majority Black. If you're going to go to if you live in a neighborhood that's majority white, then you're going to go to a high school that's majority white, right? That the segregation of schools is really simply a product of segregated neighborhoods. Okay, so we know that schools are segregated, but that doesn't yet explain why some schools are lower quality. It still doesn't explain why Black high schools and Hispanic high schools are not as good as white high schools and Asian high schools. So next we have to ask, well, how are high schools funded in America, right? How do we pay for schools, right? So some of it is paid through federal grants. About 30% of public education is paid through money through the federal government. But that also then means that the majority of the funding happens through local taxes, and in particular, property taxes, right? So that property taxes are what's paying for high schools, right? So you own a house, everybody in that neighborhood owns a house, or somebody owns that house, and everybody has to pay a certain amount of money that goes to the school of that neighborhood. Okay, so why does that matter? So then what we know then is that different racial groups are segregated, like we live in neighborhoods that are segregated. And we also know that different racial groups have different amounts of wealth. Most people's wealth is their home, is the value of their house that they're going to pay property taxes on. So if, for example, white Americans are living in a majority white neighborhood and they have more wealth than Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, that means that the taxes that they can raise for their school are going to be higher, right? In contrast, if Black Americans and Hispanic Americans have much less wealth, right, the value of their homes is much lower, that means there's going to be less property taxes going to the schools, right? And so essentially what this means is because of the structure of how we pay for schooling in America, it means that Black and Hispanic schools are going to be less well-funded than white schools, right? And so the quality of the schooling in terms of money and then of outcome is really a outcome of the structure of how we're paying for schools. And so the point here is really that this is an outcome that's not based, to a certain degree in racist individuals, but based in the very structure of our society, right? How we're paying for schooling, residential segregation, all these things. Right? So really, the reason why I talk about school quality is it's a good example of how this institutional racism, it's a good example of institutional racism. It's how an unequal outcome is being produced because of how we organize our education system. Let's talk about one more example. And I wanted to pick a kind of a really contemporary or relevant example, and that was the coronavirus, right? Something we have all been going through over the last 10 months or so, right? It seems like forever. And so we think of a disease as, simply biological, right? And everybody has a kind of a risk of getting the coronavirus or not. But what we find actually is that people of color, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Native Americans have a much higher risk of getting infected by coronavirus and becoming seriously sick from it, right? So we see in this graph here, per 100,000 people that, for example, Black Americans are 3 times as likely than white Americans, actually even more, 4 or 5 times more likely to get hospitalized, right, to have a serious coronavirus experience than white Americans and Asian Americans. And then what's even more starkly aware of is we can see that not just kind of overall, but whoops. Okay, sorry about this. We can see one moment. Okay. Sorry about that. Something was pre-recorded. Okay, so what we see here in this graph is not just about hospitalizations, but it's also about death rates. And this is data from New York City. And so what we see in this graph here is that really Black Americans are twice as likely to die from the coronavirus than white Americans. And same is true for Hispanic Americans, right? That Hispanic Americans are twice as likely to die from this virus than white and Asian Americans. And so again, what we see is an unequal outcome, right? Not just an unequal outcome in terms of economics, but really an unequal outcome in risk of dying from this disease, this virus, right? That the virus is not just randomly killing people, that the virus is hurting some Americans more than others. So again, how can we explain this, right? Why would this be happening? Again, what I'm going to argue is that this is an example of the institutional racism, right? It's an example of how our society is organized. It's not something about the virus. It's not something about the biology of Black Americans or Hispanic Americans making them more susceptible, but rather it's about the structure of our society. So it has to do with things like Black Americans and Hispanic Americans are much more likely to be essential workers, right? So much more likely to have worked in public during the pandemic, right? So giving them a higher chance of being infected. Much more likely to live in urban areas, right? So much less likely to live in rural parts of the country where because of density, there's a lower infection rate, and much more likely to live in urban areas like New York City, in which there's a higher rate of infection and therefore a higher rate of mortality, right? And then there's also the same thing is we know that people with less economic wealth now also have a higher rate of infection and a higher rate of hospitalization because of their previous health experiences. And so really what we see is that the virus is not infecting people randomly, but some people are getting hospitalized from it and some people are dying from it more often because of the structure of our society, not the biology of the virus. So that's this is the lesson for today. And all this week has been pretty negative, right? These are depressing facts. There's no way to make it seem nice or seem positive. The last thing I would want to end on is these are problems that are confronting our country. We have confronted problems like this before. Race is not something that is suddenly going to be solved. It is something that we're going to have to keep working at in America. But we can work at it, right? We can make the relations between the races better. But part of it takes, being aware of these things. The last thing I would want to say is that, race is not something we can ignore, whether we would want to or not. Race is something that we have to be aware of, and race is something that we have to talk about and deal with, whether or not it makes us uncomfortable. That's it for today's lesson.